At my daughter-in-law's birthday dinner, I noticed something strange about the place card waiting for me at the table. It didn't say Mom. It didn't say Grandma. It didn't even say my name. Instead, in elegant gold letters, it read, "Guests, please don't sit too long." For a moment, I thought it was some kind of mistake. I stood there holding the small white card between my fingers, while the rest of the family laughed and chatted around the dining table. The restaurant was warm, filled with soft music and the smell of roasted garlic and butter. Candles flickered along the center of the long table where my son, my daughter-in-law, and their friends were already seated. No one seemed to notice me standing there. Or maybe they did. Maybe they just didn't care. I forced a small smile and sat down quietly in the chair that had been assigned to me. If you're listening to my story right now, stay with me until the end. And before I continue, tell me in the comments which city you're listening from. I always wonder how far stories like mine travel. Because what happened that night was only the beginning. My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 68 years old, a widow, and until recently I believed that family meant loyalty. Especially after everything I had sacrificed for them. The dinner that night was supposed to be a celebration. My daughter-in-law Claire had just turned 35, and my son Daniel had reserved a private dining room at a restaurant in downtown Boston. It was one of those modern places with exposed brick walls, dim lighting and waiters who spoke softly as if every table contained an important secret. Claire loved places like that. I arrived 10 minutes early, carrying a small gift bag with a silk scarf I had picked out for her. It was navy blue with delicate silver stitching. Something elegant but simple. I had spent nearly an hour choosing it because I wanted her to like it. Over the years, I had learned that pleasing Claire required careful effort. Nothing too cheap. Nothing too sentimental. Nothing that reminded her too much that I was part of the family. When I walked into the private dining room, most of the guests were already there. Daniel sat at the center of the table beside Claire, his arm resting casually behind her chair. A few of Claire's friends from work were chatting loudly about a recent trip to Italy. For a moment I stood at the doorway hoping my son would notice me. He didn't. Claire did. She glanced at me briefly and then looked back at her phone. No smile. No greeting. Just a quick glance that felt more like someone acknowledging a waiter than a member of the family. I cleared my throat softly and stepped forward. "Happy birthday, Claire," I said, placing the gift bag beside her plate. "Oh," she replied, looking at the bag for half a second. "Thanks." Her voice carried the polite indifference of someone accepting a business card. Daniel finally looked up. "Hey, Mom," he said casually. "You found the place okay?" I nodded. "Yes, of course." He didn't stand to hug me. He didn't even ask me to sit beside him. Instead, he gestured vaguely toward the far end of the table. "There should be a seat for you over there." I walked slowly along the length of the table, passing clusters of Claire's friends who barely paused their conversations as I moved by. They were young, confident, dressed in sleek black outfits that looked like they belonged in magazine advertisements. I felt out of place in my simple gray sweater. But that wasn't new. The place card I found waiting for me, guest, "Please don't sit too long," sat at the very end of the table, slightly separated from the others. A quiet corner. Almost like an afterthought. For a few seconds I stared at it, wondering if someone had meant it as a joke. Claire loved jokes like that. The kind that were funny only for one person. I looked up toward the center of the table. Claire was laughing now, leaning close to Daniel while one of her friends showed photos on a phone. My son laughed along with them, completely relaxed, completely comfortable. He hadn't noticed the place card. Or maybe he had. And simply chose not to say anything. I sat down slowly, folding my hands in my lap. The waiter arrived to pour wine, moving gracefully from guest to guest. When he reached me, he hesitated slightly as he read the place card. His eyebrows lifted for just a second before he forced a polite smile. "Red or white, ma'am?" "Water is fine," I replied. He nodded and moved on. Across the table, Claire's friend Olivia leaned toward her and whispered something while glancing in my direction. Both of them giggled softly. I pretended not to notice. After 68 years, you learn how to recognize certain kinds of laughter. The kind meant to include you. And the kind meant to exclude you. Dinner began with small plates, roasted scallops, thin slices of tuna, and something green that looked expensive but tasted mostly like lemon. Everyone talked about vacations, new apartments, promotions. Not once did anyone ask me a question. I might as well have been part of the furniture. At one point Claire raised her glass. "Thank you all for coming tonight," she said brightly. Everyone lifted their glasses. "To another year of success," she added with a smile. The room echoed with cheerful agreement. I lifted my water glass quietly, though no one was looking in my direction. But then Claire added something that made my stomach tighten. "And thank you, Daniel," she continued, touching my son's hand, "for always supporting my decisions." Daniel smiled proudly. "Of course." She glanced briefly down the table. Toward me. Her expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in her eyes. "Sometimes," she said lightly, "people just need to understand their place in life." Several of her friends laughed. The comment floated through the air like a delicate piece of music. But I knew exactly who it was meant for. I lowered my glass slowly and stared at the candle burning in the center of the table. The flame trembled slightly as someone opened the door to the dining room. In that moment something inside me shifted. Not anger. Not sadness. Just clarity. Because I finally understood something I had been refusing to see for years. Claire didn't want me in her life. And my son was perfectly willing to let that happen. I didn't say anything that night. I finished my water. I thanked the waiter. And when dinner ended, I walked out of the restaurant alone into the cool Boston night. But as I stepped onto the quiet sidewalk, I realized something else. Claire believed she had already won. She believed that by humiliating me quietly, by pushing me farther and farther to the edge of the family, she could eventually erase me completely. What she didn't know was that the next morning I would receive a phone call that would change everything. And the first words the man said to me were, "Mrs. Collins, we need to talk about your husband's will." The next morning my house felt unusually quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet that comes with early sunlight and a fresh cup of coffee. This kind of silence felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I woke up earlier than usual. Years of routine have a way of doing that to you once you reach a certain age. Even after retirement, my body still rises with the sun. For a few moments I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The events of the previous night replayed slowly in my mind. The place card. The laughter. Claire's voice saying people just need to understand their place in life. I didn't feel angry. At least, not in the way younger people might imagine. It was more like the quiet realization that a door you thought was open had actually been closed for years. You just hadn't noticed. I pushed the blankets aside and walked into the kitchen. The house I lived in wasn't large, but every room carried decades of memories. My husband, Robert, and I had bought it nearly 40 years ago when Daniel was still a boy who loved building forts in the living room with couch cushions. Back then the house was full of noise. Saturday mornings meant pancakes and spilled orange juice. Sunday evenings meant family dinners at the same oak table that still sat in my dining room today. Robert used to sit at the head of that table reading the newspaper while Daniel told endless stories about school. Those were good years. Simple years. After Robert passed away 3 years ago, the house became quieter. But I had always believed that family would continue to fill it. Daniel visited often at first. Sometimes he would come by after work, bringing takeout containers and stories about his job in finance downtown. But things slowly changed after he married Claire. It didn't happen all at once. It was subtle. Sunday dinners became too busy this week. Holiday visits became shorter. Phone calls became less frequent. And eventually, most of our conversations happened through brief text messages. Claire never said anything openly cruel in those early years. Not at first. She was simply efficient. Efficient about setting boundaries. Efficient about organizing holidays at her parents' house instead of mine. Efficient about reminding Daniel that our house was too far from downtown traffic. The distance between us grew so gradually that by the time I truly noticed it, the gap felt impossible to cross. I filled a kettle with water and placed it on the stove. The small clicking sound of the burner igniting echoed softly in the kitchen. For a while I stood there watching the blue flame. People imagine that moments of clarity arrive like lightning. In truth, they arrive much more quietly, like a fog slowly lifting. The dinner the night before hadn't surprised me as much as it should have, because somewhere deep down I had already known. I poured hot water into a mug, and carried it to the dining room table. The same oak table where Daniel once did his homework. The same table where Robert proposed to me with a small velvet ring box and nervous hands. I sat down and wrapped both hands around the mug. For a few minutes I simply listened to the quiet. Then the phone rang. The sound startled me enough that I almost spilled the tea. I glanced at the screen. The number wasn't familiar. For a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. Unknown numbers usually meant telemarketers or insurance companies trying to sell something I didn't need. But something about the early hour made me hesitate. I answered. Hello. The voice on the other end was calm and professional. Mrs. Margaret Collins? Yes. This is Thomas Green calling. I'm an attorney with Green and Halstead. I frowned slightly. I'm sorry, I don't believe we've met. That's correct, ma'am, he said politely. But I represent the estate of your late husband, Robert Collins. My grip tightened around the phone. Robert's estate had been settled years ago. At least that's what I had always believed. Yes, I said slowly. What about it? There was a brief pause. The kind of pause people take when choosing their words carefully. Mrs. Collins, Mr. Green continued, there appears to be a matter regarding your husband's final instructions that has not yet been properly addressed. I stared at the window above the kitchen sink. Outside, the early morning light was spreading across the quiet street. What kind of matter? I asked. It concerns a document that was meant to be delivered under specific circumstances. Specific circumstances? Yes, ma'am. Another pause. Then he said something that made my heart beat a little faster. The document was to remain sealed until certain events occurred. I felt a strange chill move through me. And what events would those be? Mr. Green cleared his throat softly. One of those conditions, he said, was if you were ever asked to leave the family home, or otherwise treated as unwelcome by members of your immediate family. The room seemed to grow very still. For a moment I said nothing. Then I remembered the place card from the night before. Yes, please don't sit too long. My voice was quiet when I finally spoke. And you believe that condition has been met? I do, he replied carefully. Which is why I'm calling. I took a slow breath. What exactly did my husband leave behind? Mr. Green answered with the calm certainty of someone who had spent many years delivering unexpected news. Mrs. Collins, he said, your husband left instructions that, once activated, will significantly change the control of several assets connected to your family. I closed my eyes. Robert had always been a thoughtful man. But this sounded like something else entirely. Perhaps, the attorney continued gently, it would be best if we discussed everything in person. When? As soon as possible. I looked down at the quiet kitchen table. The same table where Daniel used to sit beside me as a child. The same son who had pointed toward the end of the restaurant table the night before and said, there should be a seat for you over there. I opened my eyes again. All right, I said. Tell me where to come. The office of Green and Halstead was located on the 12th floor of a quiet building overlooking Boston Harbor. It wasn't the kind of place that tried to impress people with marble floors or extravagant decorations. Everything was understated. Clean lines. Soft lighting. Shelves filled with leather-bound legal volumes that looked like they had been there for decades. The receptionist greeted me politely when I arrived. Mrs. Collins? Yes. Mr. Green is expecting you. She guided me down a narrow hallway lined with framed diplomas and photographs of courtroom ceremonies. I noticed how quiet the office was. No loud conversations. No ringing phones echoing through the halls. Just the steady hum of people working carefully. The kind of place Robert would have respected. Thomas Green stood up from behind his desk when I entered the room. He looked to be in his early 60s, with silver hair and the calm demeanor of someone who had spent most of his life handling complicated family matters. Mrs. Collins, he said, offering his hand. His handshake was firm but respectful. Thank you for coming on such short notice. I was curious, I replied honestly. He gestured toward the chair across from his desk. Please have a seat. I sat down slowly, placing my purse on the floor beside me. For a moment neither of us spoke. Mr. Green opened a large folder resting on his desk and adjusted his glasses. Before we begin, he said carefully, I want to make something very clear. Your husband, Robert Collins, was an extremely thoughtful man. I felt a small smile appear despite myself. Yes, I said quietly. He was. Mr. Green nodded. In fact, during the final months of his life, he spent a considerable amount of time planning how to protect you. That sentence made me straighten slightly in the chair. Protect me? Yes. He slid a sealed envelope across the desk toward me. The paper was slightly yellowed with age, and my husband's handwriting was clearly visible across the front. Margaret, to be opened only if necessary. For a moment my fingers hovered above the envelope. Robert's handwriting always had a certain steadiness to it. Even after decades of marriage I could recognize it instantly. Your husband left very specific instructions regarding this letter, Mr. Green explained. What kind of instructions? That it should remain sealed unless certain conditions were met. I already knew the answer to my next question. And one of those conditions was? If you were ever treated as though you were no longer welcome within your own family. I looked down at the envelope again. Robert had always been observant. Even in small moments. Especially in small moments. Did he say why? I asked. Mr. Green leaned back slightly in his chair. He believed that, after his passing, you might eventually face pressure regarding your home and certain financial assets. The words landed slowly. Pressure regarding my home. My thoughts immediately returned to the restaurant the night before. The place card. Yes, please don't sit too long, Claire's voice. People just need to understand their place. I exhaled quietly. And this letter explains everything? Not everything, Mr. Green said. But it begins to. I carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Robert's handwriting filled the page. I recognized the blue ink from the pen he kept in the kitchen drawer. For a moment my eyes blurred slightly as I began reading. Margaret, if you are reading this letter, it means something has happened that I hoped would never occur. But if it has, then you must listen carefully. Our son is a good man. I truly believe that. But good men can be influenced by the wrong people. Especially when love and ambition become tangled together. Claire is intelligent, ambitious, and far more interested in control than she appears. I began to notice this during the final year of my illness. I stopped reading. A strange mix of emotions moved through me. Not anger. Not yet. More like the slow realization that Robert had been seeing something I had refused to notice. I continued reading. I have taken steps to ensure that no one can pressure you into leaving the house we built together. The legal structure surrounding our assets has already been established. But the final stage will only activate if certain conditions are met. If anyone ever attempts to push you aside, you will not stand alone. My fingers tightened slightly around the paper. Across the desk, Mr. Green watched quietly. Your husband established several legal protections, he explained gently. What kind of protections? The kind that most families never expect. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. Explain. Mr. Green turned another document toward me. Your husband created a trust structure 3 months before he passed away. I frowned slightly. A trust? Yes. One that currently holds the legal ownership of multiple properties and financial accounts. The room felt suddenly very quiet. What properties? Mr. Green tapped the document lightly. The family home. My house. The investment building on Beacon Street. I blinked. Robert had purchased that small building years ago as a long-term investment. And several additional accounts tied to Robert's retirement portfolio. I stared at the paper. But Daniel handles most of the financial matters now, I said slowly. Mr. Green gave a small nod. Yes. Your son has access to certain operational accounts. Then he added calmly, but he does not control the trust. I looked up. Who does? Mr. Green met my eyes. You do. For a moment, the meaning of that statement didn't fully register. Then it did. And suddenly, Claire's voice from the restaurant echoed in my mind again. People just need to understand their place. I placed the envelope gently on the desk. What exactly happens now? Mr. Green folded his hands. That depends entirely on you, Mrs. Collins. I sat there quietly thinking about my son, thinking about Claire, thinking about the dinner table where my place card had labeled me as a guest. After 40 years in the same home, I finally spoke. What would my husband want me to do? Mr. Green smiled faintly. I believe, he said, your husband already anticipated that question. And then he reached for another document inside the folder. Mr. Green slid the second document across the desk with the same careful precision he had used with the envelope. I noticed something about lawyers over the years. The good ones move slowly, deliberately, as if every sheet of paper carries more weight than it appears to. This, he said, is the final instruction your husband left regarding the trust. I looked down at the document. The title at the top read, Contingency Activation Clause. Legal language has a way of sounding colder than real life. But sometimes that coldness hides something very personal. I traced the edge of the paper with my fingertips. What does it say? I asked. Mr. Green folded his hands. It states that if the conditions described in your husband's letter are confirmed, the trust becomes fully active under your authority. I raised my eyes. Fully active? Yes. He pointed to several lines on the document. This means you gain immediate and exclusive control over the properties and financial structures Robert placed inside the trust. I read the numbers listed on the page. The Beacon Street building. Several investment accounts. The house. Our house. For 40 years that house had simply been home. Not an asset. Not a legal entity. Just the place where life happened. But now the words on the page made it sound different. Stronger. Protected. Robert believed, Mr. Green continued calmly, that there might come a moment when someone attempted to pressure you into selling the home or transferring ownership. My mind immediately drifted back to a conversation. From nearly 6 months earlier, Claire had been standing in my kitchen, leaning casually against the counter. Daniel was beside her, scrolling through his phone. Claire had spoken lightly, almost as if she were discussing a restaurant reservation. You know, Margaret, she had said, this neighborhood has become incredibly valuable lately. I had smiled politely. Yes, it has. She had glanced around the room. All this space for just one person. It must feel like a lot to manage. Daniel hadn't said anything. He had simply kept looking at his phone. Claire continued. You could probably sell this house for a very good price now. I remembered the way she had said sell. Not as a suggestion. As a calculation. At the time I had simply nodded and changed the subject. I looked back at Mr. Green. And Robert expected this? The lawyer gave a small nod. He noticed certain conversations during the final year of his illness. The memory of Robert sitting quietly at the dining room table appeared suddenly in my mind. He had always been a quiet observer. The kind of man who listened more than he spoke. Claire probably thought he hadn't noticed anything. But Robert noticed everything. He told me once, Mr. Green continued, that protecting you was the most important thing he could still do. The words settled heavily in the room. I lowered my eyes to the document again. What exactly happens if the trust activates? I asked. Mr. Green tapped another section of the page. The moment activation occurs, all control of the assets transfers solely to you. And Daniel. He continues to have access to his own finances, Mr. Green said carefully. But he no longer has influence over the trust. Influence. That word mattered more than money. I leaned back slightly in the chair. The office window behind Mr. Green overlooked the harbor. Small boats moved slowly across the gray water in the distance. Everything outside looked calm. Inside the room, something much larger was unfolding. Does Daniel know about this? I asked. No, Claire. Absolutely not. I let out a quiet breath. Robert had never liked unnecessary confrontation. He believed in preparation, in patience, in making sure the right moment arrived before acting. Your husband also left one additional instruction, Mr. Green said. What instruction? That the activation of the trust should only happen if you decide it's necessary. I looked up. So the decision is mine. Yes. He paused for a moment before continuing. Robert believed that forcing your hand would go against the life the two of you built together. The room grew quiet again. I thought about Daniel as a little boy, running through the backyard with grass stains on his knees, asking endless questions about how things worked. He used to hold Robert's hand when we walked to the park. At some point along the way, That boy had become a man who no longer looked at his mother when she entered a room. People change slowly, almost invisibly, until suddenly you realize they're not the same person at all. What happens if I activate it? I asked. Mr. Green answered calmly. Once the trust is activated, no one can legally force you to sell the home. And if someone tries, the trust would prevent it. And the Beacon Street building? You would control it. I sat quietly for a moment. Claire's voice echoed again in my memory. People just need to understand their place. I wondered what she believed my place actually was. Probably somewhere small, quiet, at the end of the table. A guest. Someone who shouldn't stay too long. I looked back at the document. What do I need to do? I asked. Mr. Green opened a pen and placed it gently beside the paper. If you decide to activate the trust, he said, you simply sign here. The pen rested between us. Such a small object. Yet it held the power to change everything Claire thought she understood about my life. Picked it up slowly. For a moment I didn't move. Because something Robert used to say came back to me. He would say it whenever Daniel tried to rush into a decision as a teenager. The most powerful choices are the quiet ones. I set the tip of the pen against the line. And then I paused. Because before making that choice, there was something else I needed to understand. And the answer to that question would arrive later that evening, when Daniel knocked on my front door. When I left Mr. Green's office that afternoon, the air outside felt colder than it had in the morning. Boston Harbor stretched out in front of the building, gray and quiet under a sky that looked like it might snow later. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, holding my purse with both hands, letting the wind move through my hair. Inside that office, my life had shifted in a way Claire could never imagine. But nothing on the outside looked different. Cars moved along the street. People walked past me carrying coffee cups and briefcases. No one knew that a single signature on a document could quietly rearrange the balance of power inside my own family. I didn't sign the paper. Not yet. Robert had always believed in patience. And something told me that the right moment had not arrived. So I drove home. The house looked the same as it always had when I pulled into the driveway. The small maple tree Robert planted 20 years ago still stood beside the front porch. Its leaves had turned the deep red color that only appears for a short time in New England autumns. I sat in the car for a minute before getting out. 40 years. That was how long Robert and I had lived there. Every window carried a memory. Every corner held some small piece of the life we built together. Inside, the house was quiet again. I placed my purse on the kitchen counter and walked slowly through the living room. The afternoon light fell across the wooden floorboards in long stripes. The same floor Daniel used to race toy cars across when he was 7. I stopped beside the old oak dining table. The surface was worn smooth from years of use. Robert used to say furniture like that told the truth about a family. You could see where people sat, where they leaned, where they gathered. I ran my fingers along the edge of the table. Then I made myself a cup of tea. Simple things have a way of grounding you when life starts shifting beneath your feet. By the time the kettle finished boiling, the sun had already begun to lower behind the trees outside. That was when I heard the knock. 3 quick taps against the front door. I didn't rush to answer it. People who arrive unexpectedly rarely bring simple conversations. When I opened the door, Daniel stood on the porch. My son looked tired. His tie was loosened, and the sleeves of his white dress shirt were rolled halfway up his arms. He must have come straight from the office. For a moment we simply looked at each other. He had Robert's eyes. That was something that had always stayed the same. "Hi, Mom," he said. His voice sounded careful. "Hello, Daniel." He stepped inside without waiting to be invited, glancing around the house in the way people do when they're measuring something. "How are you?" he asked. "I'm fine." He nodded. Claire mentioned dinner last night might have felt awkward. Awkward. That was the word he chose. Not humiliating. Not insulting. Just awkward. "I see," I said calmly. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "You know how Claire's friends can be. They like jokes." I said nothing. He shifted his weight slightly. "Anyway," he continued, "that's actually not why I came." Of course it wasn't. People rarely drive across the city after work to discuss a joke. "What brings you here then?" I asked. Daniel glanced toward the living room, then back at me. Claire and I have been talking about the house. There it was. The sentence Robert had expected years ago. I folded my hands in front of me. What about it? Daniel took a slow breath. Mom. This place is too big for one person. I waited. You're getting older, he added. Older. Another word people use when they want to sound reasonable. The market is very strong right now, he continued. You could sell this house for a very good price. His voice carried the calm tone of someone explaining an investment opportunity. Claire found a really nice condo building downtown, he added. Smaller place. Much easier to manage. I could almost hear her voice behind the suggestion. Organized. Calculated. Daniel looked at me carefully. You wouldn't have to worry about yard work or maintenance anymore. I noticed he didn't mention something else. Where I would sit at their dinner table. Or whether there would be a seat for me at all. And what would happen to this house? I asked. Daniel shrugged lightly. Well, Claire and I thought we might move here eventually. The words landed softly, but the meaning behind them was loud. They weren't suggesting I move for my comfort. They were planning their future. In my home. Daniel looked relieved to finally be saying it out loud. It just makes sense, he said. From a financial perspective. Financial perspective. I studied my son's face. Somewhere behind that calm explanation was the little boy who once cried when he lost his first baseball glove. But tonight I saw something different. Not cruelty. Just distance. Daniel, I said quietly. Yes. Did Claire send you here tonight? He hesitated. Just for a second. That was enough of an answer. He sighed. She's just trying to help you think about the future. I nodded slowly. The future. Robert had already thought about that. More carefully than any of them realized. I turned toward the kitchen counter and picked up the kettle. Would you like some tea? I asked. Daniel blinked, surprised by the question. Sure. I poured 2 cups. The kitchen filled with the quiet sound of water meeting porcelain. Then I set 1 cup in front of him and sat down at the table. Daniel wrapped his hands around the mug. So what do you think? He asked. I looked at him calmly. And for the first time since he arrived, I allowed myself a small smile. Daniel, I said softly, there's something about this house you should probably know. And suddenly, for the first time that evening, my son looked uncertain. Daniel stared at me across the kitchen table, still holding the cup of tea I had poured for him. Steam rose slowly from the surface of the mug, curling into the quiet air between us. There's something about this house you should probably know, I had just said. For a moment Daniel didn't answer. I could see the uncertainty flicker across his face. What do you mean? He asked. His voice was careful now. The confident tone he had used earlier, the one that talked about market value and financial perspective, had faded slightly. I took a small sip of my tea before answering. You said Claire found a condo for me downtown, I said calmly. Daniel nodded. Yes. It's in a really nice building. Elevator, security, maintenance staff. It would make things much easier for you. Easier. That word again. I placed the cup down gently. Daniel, I said. Have you ever wondered why your father never talked about selling this house? Daniel frowned slightly. What do you mean? Dad loved this place. Yes, I replied quietly. He did. For a moment I looked around the kitchen. The same cabinets Robert had installed himself 20 years ago. The small dent in the refrigerator door from when Daniel crashed his bicycle into it at age 10. Memories have a way of attaching themselves to ordinary things. But Robert had always seen something else too. The future. He made sure it would stay exactly where it is, I continued. Daniel leaned forward slightly. What are you talking about? I folded my hands together on the table. Your father placed the house inside a trust before he died. The silence that followed was immediate. Daniel blinked. A trust? Yes. His brow furrowed. Why would he do that? To protect it. Daniel leaned back in his chair, processing the information. Protect it from what? I held his gaze. From pressure. He looked confused. Pressure from who? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I let the quiet stretch across the table. Daniel shifted slightly in his seat. Mom, if this is about Claire, It's not about Claire, I said gently. That wasn't entirely true. But it wasn't entirely false either. It's about preparation. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. So the house is in a trust, he said slowly. That doesn't really change anything. You still own it. Yes, I said. But the trust controls what happens to it. His eyes narrowed slightly. What does that mean? It means no one can pressure me to sell it. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, then paused. I wasn't pressuring you, he said. His tone carried a hint of defensiveness now. I was just trying to help you think about the future. I understand, I said calmly. And I did. In Daniel's mind, he probably believed he was being practical. People often mistake practicality for kindness. What else does the trust include? He asked. I noticed the way he asked the question. Not if there was more. But what? The Beacon Street building, I said. Daniel's eyebrows lifted. The investment property? Yes. He leaned forward again. I thought that was part of Dad's retirement accounts. It was. And now it's in the trust? Yes. Daniel let out a slow breath. That building is worth a lot of money now. I said nothing. He glanced around the kitchen again, as if seeing the house differently for the first time. So the trust owns the house and the Beacon Street property, he said. That's correct. Daniel looked back at me. Who manages the trust? I do. Another silence. This one lasted longer. Daniel stared at me as if trying to understand something that didn't quite fit the picture he had expected when he knocked on the door earlier that evening. You manage it, he repeated. Yes. But Dad never mentioned that. Robert believed certain conversations were better handled quietly. Daniel ran his hand across his face. So if the house is in the trust, that means selling it would be more complicated. Yes. How complicated? It can't be sold without my approval. Daniel exhaled slowly. I see. For the first time since he arrived, the conversation had shifted. Not dramatically, but enough. He looked down at the table thinking. Then he asked the question that had probably been forming in his mind since the moment I mentioned the trust. Does Claire know about this? No, his eyes lifted again. And you're planning to tell her? I smiled slightly. I'm not sure that's necessary. Daniel stared at me for a moment. You're serious? Yes. He leaned back in his chair again. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Outside the window, the sky had darkened into evening. Streetlights flickered on one by one along the quiet road. Finally Daniel said something that surprised me. She's going to be disappointed. I tilted my head slightly. Disappointed? Well, we thought the house would eventually be part of our long-term plan. That word carried more weight than the rest of the sentence. Daniel wasn't speaking only for himself anymore. Claire's voice echoed inside that word. I picked up my tea again. Plans change, I said quietly. Daniel studied me carefully now. You're not upset about last night? He asked. No. Because it kind of sounds like you are. I'm not upset, I replied. And that was true. What I felt was something else entirely. Clarity. The kind that arrives after years of slowly ignoring what was right in front of you. Daniel nodded slowly. Well, I guess we'll have to talk about it again later. Yes, I said. I imagine we will. He finished the rest of his tea and stood up. At the door he paused. Claire will probably want to discuss this with you too, he said. I'm sure she will. Daniel gave a small nod. Then he stepped outside into the evening. I closed the door gently behind him. And as I stood there in the quiet hallway, one thought crossed my mind. Claire believed the house was simply a matter of timing. A matter of waiting until the right moment to convince me to move. What she didn't know yet was that Robert had already decided exactly how that conversation would end. The house felt different after Daniel left that evening. Not louder. Not quieter. Just clearer. When you live in the same place for 40 years, you begin to understand the rhythm of it. The creak in the floorboards near the staircase. The soft whistle the kettle makes just before it boils. The way the evening light falls across the living room rug in winter. That night, everything felt sharper somehow. Like the fog had finally lifted. I cleaned the teacups slowly and placed them in the drying rack beside the sink. Daniel had only been gone for 10 minutes, but the conversation we had just shared replayed quietly in my mind. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was revealing. Daniel hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't been cruel. He had simply assumed something. That the house would eventually become his. Or more accurately, Claire's. That assumption had been sitting quietly between us for months, maybe even years. And now it had finally been spoken out loud. I turned off the kitchen light and walked into the living room. Robert's armchair still sat beside the window. I never moved it after he passed away. Not because I couldn't, but because some things deserve to stay exactly where they belong. I sat down across from it and folded my hands together. Robert used to sit there in the evenings reading the newspaper while Daniel did his homework at the dining table. Back then, the house felt like the center of the world. Families don't usually notice when that center begins to shift. It happens slowly. One holiday spent somewhere else. One dinner canceled. One conversation shortened. Until eventually the house becomes something different. A place people visit instead of belong to. I glanced at the clock on the wall. 7:48 p.m. Claire would already know about our conversation. Daniel wasn't the kind of man who kept things to himself for very long. Sure enough, the phone rang. I didn't even look at the screen. I already knew who it was. I let it ring once. Twice. Then I answered. Hello, Claire. There was a short pause on the other end. You already know it's me? She asked. Yes. Her voice sounded polished as always. Claire was very good at controlling the tone of a conversation before it even began. Daniel told me you had an interesting discussion tonight, she said. Yes, I replied. We did. Another pause. Well, Claire continued lightly, I just wanted to make sure there wasn't any misunderstanding about what we talked about last night at dinner. Misunderstanding. That word again. Claire loved words that softened the edges of things. Which part? I asked. The house. I leaned back slightly in my chair. Yes. The house. Claire cleared her throat softly. Daniel mentioned you told him something about a trust. That's correct. And that you control it. Yes. Her silence lasted a little longer this time. I see, she said finally. I could almost hear the calculations happening in her mind. Claire worked in corporate consulting. She had once told me that the key to successful negotiation was information. The person with the most information controlled the room. Right now, she was realizing she didn't have it. So the house isn't exactly available, she said carefully. No, I replied. It isn't. Another pause. Then she shifted her tone slightly. Well, Margaret, she said. I hope you understand Daniel and I were only thinking about what's best for you. I'm sure you were. We just worry about you living alone in such a large place. I appreciate the concern. Claire exhaled softly. But realistically, she continued, houses like that require maintenance. And the market conditions right now are extremely favorable. There it was again. Not family. Not memories. Market conditions. I'm comfortable where I am, I said. Claire let out a small laugh. Of course you are. But sometimes comfort prevents people from making smart decisions. Her voice carried the same polite confidence she used at the restaurant the night before. I looked around the room again. The photographs on the wall. Daniel's graduation picture. Robert standing beside the maple tree in the yard 20 years ago. Claire, I said calmly. Yes. Robert anticipated this conversation. Her response came quickly. What do you mean? He created the trust specifically so that no one could pressure me into selling the house. Claire didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded tighter. Pressure is a strong word. Is it? Well, yes, she said. We were only making a suggestion. I nodded even, though she couldn't see it. Then I'm declining it. Silence filled the line. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then Claire asked the question she had probably been holding back since the moment Daniel mentioned the trust. Margaret, exactly what else is inside that trust? There it was. Not concern. Not curiosity. Information. I let the quiet stretch just long enough. Then I answered. Enough. Claire didn't laugh this time. What does that mean? It means Robert made sure I will never have to rely on anyone else's plans for my future. The line remained silent. Finally Claire said something that revealed more than she probably intended. "Well," she said slowly, "that certainly changes things." Yes, it did. But not in the way Claire was thinking. Because at that moment she still believed this conversation was about the house. What she didn't know yet was that the house was only the beginning of what Robert had protected. The next 2 days passed quietly. Quiet on the surface at least. But underneath that quiet, something had shifted. Claire didn't call again after our conversation that night. That alone told me more than any words could have. When Claire believed she was in control of a situation, she liked to talk. She liked to explain things, guide things, frame things in a way that made her position sound logical. But silence meant something else. Silence meant she was gathering information. I knew that because Robert had once described her that way. She doesn't react right away, he told me one evening during the last winter of his illness. She studies the board before she moves a piece. At the time I thought he was exaggerating. Now I understood what he meant. On Thursday morning my phone rang again. This time it was Daniel. "Hey Mom," he said. His voice sounded careful again. Not tense, but measured. "Good morning," I replied. "Claire and I were wondering if we could come by tonight." There it was. Not Claire wants to talk. Claire and I. 2 voices. 1 message. "Of course," I said calmly. "What time works for you?" 7. "That's fine." We hung up without saying much more. I spent the rest of the afternoon the same way I usually did. I watered the small plants on the kitchen windowsill. I walked down the street to the mailbox. I read a few pages of the novel that had been sitting on my nightstand for weeks. But my mind kept drifting back to Robert. Specifically, to the final conversation we had about Claire. He had been sitting in his chair by the window. The same chair that still faced the maple tree outside. "Margaret," he said quietly, "if there ever comes a day when they start treating you like you're in the way, promise me something." "What?" "Promise me you won't shrink yourself to make them comfortable." At the time I laughed. "I don't think that's going to happen." Robert didn't laugh. He just looked out the window. "People reveal themselves slowly," he said. 7 o'clock arrived right on time. Daniel's car pulled into the driveway just as the streetlights flickered on. Claire stepped out of the passenger seat first. She was wearing a dark coat and heeled boots, her hair tied back neatly the way it always was when she wanted to appear composed. Daniel followed a few seconds later. I opened the door before they could knock. "Good evening," I said. Claire smiled politely. "Thank you for seeing us, Margaret." Her tone was warm. Warmer than the night before. But warmth isn't always sincerity. Sometimes it's strategy. We moved into the living room. Daniel sat on the couch while Claire chose the armchair across from him. The same armchair Robert used to sit in when we hosted guests years ago. I remained standing for a moment before taking the seat opposite them. "So," Claire said lightly, folding her hands in her lap, "Daniel told me about the trust." "Yes. That's quite an interesting arrangement Robert made." "It is." Claire tilted her head slightly. "But there's something I'd like to clarify." I waited. "The trust protects the house," she continued. "But surely the rest of Robert's assets were distributed normally." "Normally." Another careful word. "What do you mean?" I asked. "Well," she said, glancing briefly at Daniel before looking back at me. "Daniel always told me that the Beacon Street building was part of the family's shared financial planning." Daniel shifted slightly beside her. Claire continued speaking smoothly. "And if that property is inside the trust, then technically the trust controls a fairly large portion of the family's long-term assets." Family assets. I noticed how easily she used that phrase. Robert would have noticed too. "Yes," I said calmly. Claire leaned forward slightly. "That creates a rather unusual situation." "How so?" "Well," she said, choosing her words carefully, "most families structure things so the next generation eventually assumes responsibility." Eventually. Another assumption. Claire's entire argument rested on one quiet belief. That everything Robert built would naturally move toward them. Toward Daniel. Toward her. Daniel cleared his throat. "Claire just means that it might make sense to review the trust structure together." Together. I looked at my son. Who would be reviewing it? I asked. "Well, us," he said. And a financial advisor maybe. I nodded slowly. Claire smiled again. We're only trying to make sure everything is organized efficiently. Efficient. Claire liked efficient things. Efficient homes. Efficient investments. Efficient family structures. But Robert had never believed family should be efficient. He believed it should be loyal. I spoke with Robert's attorney this week, I said. Claire's smile tightened slightly. You did? Yes. And he confirmed the trust is functioning exactly the way Robert intended. Claire studied my face carefully. And what exactly was Robert's intention? For a moment the room was quiet. Then I answered. To ensure that I would never be pressured into giving up control of the life we built together. Daniel looked uncomfortable. Claire didn't move. Instead she asked the question she had been working toward since the moment she sat down. And after you? I tilted my head. After me. Yes, Claire said calmly. When the time comes, who inherits the trust? There it was. Not about the house. Not about the Beacon Street building. About the future. About control. About ownership. I leaned back in the chair. That, I said quietly, is something Robert also thought about very carefully. Claire's eyes sharpened slightly. And I smiled gently. And you might find his decision surprising. Claire didn't blink when I said Robert's decision might surprise her. But I saw something else in her expression. Attention. Not curiosity. Calculation. The room had grown very still. Outside the living room window, the streetlight cast a soft yellow glow across the driveway where Daniel's car was parked. Inside, the three of us sat quietly for a moment. Claire broke the silence first. Well, she said calmly, I suppose Robert must have made arrangements for Daniel. Her tone carried the quiet certainty of someone who believed the answer was already obvious. After all, Daniel was Robert's only child. The natural heir. The expected future. Daniel shifted slightly beside her. Yeah, he said. I mean, that would make sense. I looked at my son for a moment. He wasn't being greedy. Not in his mind. He was simply following the story most people grow up believing. Parents build something. Children inherit it. Life moves forward. But Robert had always been a careful man. Especially when it came to promises. Robert did make arrangements, I said quietly. Claire leaned forward just a little. And he created a second condition within the trust. Daniel frowned. What kind of condition? A behavioral clause. Claire's expression changed slightly. Just for a moment. The smallest shift. But it was there. What exactly does that mean? She asked. I folded my hands in my lap. It means that the inheritance of the trust is tied to certain expectations. Daniel looked confused. Expectations? Yes. Like what? I stood up slowly and walked toward the bookshelf beside the living room wall. Robert had kept many things there. Old photo albums. Travel journals. And one small leather folder. I brought it back to the coffee table and opened it carefully. Inside was a copy of the document Mr. Green had shown me earlier that day. I placed it gently on the table. Daniel leaned forward to read. Claire remained perfectly still. The trust names Daniel as the primary successor, I said. Daniel nodded slowly. Okay. Claire's shoulders relaxed slightly. But I continued speaking. However, the transfer of control does not happen automatically. Daniel looked up. What do you mean? It means that before the trust passes to you, certain conditions must remain satisfied. Daniel looked down at the document again. What conditions? I tapped the page lightly. Robert believed that inheritance should reflect character. Claire's eyes narrowed slightly. Character, she repeated. Yes. Robert had written the clause himself. The words were simple, but their meaning was clear. If Daniel or his spouse attempt to pressure Margaret Collins into leaving her residence, or attempt to influence the sale or control of trust properties for personal benefit. I paused for a moment. Then I finished the sentence. Their inheritance rights will be permanently revoked. The words hung quietly in the room. Daniel looked up at me slowly. What? Claire didn't move. Not even slightly. Daniel read the sentence again. Revoked. Yes. But that doesn't make sense, he said quickly. We weren't pressuring you. Said nothing. He continued. We were just trying to help you make a practical decision. Claire spoke for the first time since the clause had been read. Margaret, she said calmly, surely Robert didn't intend that clause to apply to simple conversations. I looked at her. What kind of conversations? You know, she said smoothly. Family discussions about long-term planning. Daniel nodded quickly. Exactly. I watched them both. Two people trying very carefully to redefine the moment. Robert had anticipated that too. That's why the clause includes something else, I said. Claire's eyes sharpened again. What? Documentation. Daniel frowned. What documentation? Robert instructed his attorney to record any verified attempt to influence the trust's assets. Claire leaned back slowly in her chair. And how exactly would that happen? The attorney reviews any relevant evidence. Daniel looked confused. Evidence? Yes. I reached for my phone and placed it gently on the coffee table. Claire's eyes flicked toward it immediately. Last night's dinner, I said quietly. What about it? Daniel asked. The place card. Daniel frowned. What place card? I turned the phone screen toward them. Earlier that morning, I had taken a photograph of the card before leaving the restaurant. The words were still clear. Yes, please don't sit too long. Daniel stared at the screen. What is that? The seat Claire arranged for me. Daniel's head turned slowly toward his wife. Claire remained composed. That was a joke, she said calmly. Was it? Yes. Daniel looked uncertain now. Claire continued. Margaret, if you're suggesting that something like that qualifies as pressure, I think that's an overreaction. Perhaps, I said. But the conversation tonight would also be reviewed. Daniel looked back at me. You're saying the trust could be taken away? I'm saying Robert built protections. Claire stood up suddenly. That's ridiculous. Her voice remained controlled, but the calm tone had cracked slightly. We were discussing normal financial planning. Were we? Daniel looked between us. Mom, come on. I held his gaze. Daniel, I said gently. Your father believed one thing very strongly. What? That respect inside a family should never need to be negotiated. The room was silent again. Claire looked at the document one more time. Then she turned toward Daniel. We're leaving. Daniel hesitated. Claire. Now. They walked toward the door together. Daniel paused just before stepping outside. Mom. You're really serious about this? I nodded. Yes. He stood there for another moment. Then he followed Claire out into the night. I closed the door quietly behind them. And as the house returned to silence, I realized something important. Claire had believed this entire situation was about money. But Robert had never been protecting money. He had been protecting something much more important. The dignity of the woman he married 40 years earlier. The house was quiet again after Daniel and Claire left. The kind of quiet that settles in slowly, like snow falling outside a window. I stood in the hallway for a moment after closing the door, listening to the sound of Daniel's car starting in the driveway. The engine hummed softly before the headlights swept across the front lawn and disappeared down the street. Then everything went still. For a few seconds I simply stood there with my hand resting on the doorframe. 40 years of family life had taught me something simple. The loudest moments in a family are rarely the ones that matter most. It's the quiet ones afterward. I turned off the living room lamp and walked back into the kitchen. The teacups from earlier were still sitting in the sink. Daniel had barely touched his drink before Claire insisted they leave. I rinsed them slowly, placing them in the drying rack beside the window. Outside, the maple tree Robert planted years ago moved slightly in the evening breeze. That tree had grown taller than the roofline now. Just like Daniel had grown taller than his father by the time he finished high school. For a moment I wondered what Robert would say if he had been sitting in the room tonight. Probably nothing. Robert was never the kind of man who raised his voice. He believed silence often spoke louder. I dried my hands with a towel and turned off the kitchen light. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Not because I was upset, but because my mind kept returning to something Claire said before she left. That's ridiculous. She had said it so confidently, as if the entire situation could be dismissed with a single word. But Robert had never built things carelessly, especially not the things that mattered most. The next morning arrived quietly. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen window, falling across the table where Daniel used to eat cereal before school. I made coffee and sat down, in the same chair Robert had used for decades. For a few minutes, I simply watched the steam rise from the mug. Then my phone vibrated. A message. Not from Daniel. From Claire. That surprised me. Claire preferred direct control over conversations. Phone calls, meetings, negotiations. Text messages were usually reserved for things she didn't want to discuss out loud. I opened it. The message was short. Claire, we should talk again. Daniel is very upset about what happened last night. I read the sentence twice. Very upset. That phrasing told me a lot. Claire wasn't saying she was upset. She was presenting Daniel as the emotional center of the problem. A careful strategy. I placed the phone down on the table without answering. Because Robert had taught me something else during our years together. You don't rush into the next conversation when the first one hasn't finished unfolding. 10 minutes later, the phone rang. This time it was Daniel. I answered. Good morning, I said. Daniel sounded tired. Mom, we need to talk. His voice carried a strain I hadn't heard in years. What would you like to talk about? I asked. That clause Dad wrote. I remained silent. It doesn't make sense, he continued. There must be some misunderstanding. What part doesn't make sense? The idea that our inheritance could disappear because of one conversation. I took a sip of coffee before answering. It wasn't one conversation. Daniel paused. What do you mean? Your father didn't create that clause because of one dinner. Another silence. Then Daniel spoke again more quietly. You think Claire has been manipulating things. I didn't answer that directly. Your father noticed certain patterns during his last year. Daniel exhaled slowly. Mom, Claire isn't trying to hurt you. I didn't say she was. Then what is she doing? I looked around the kitchen again. The same room where Daniel once asked me if Santa Claus really fit down the chimney. Children grow up believing their parents understand the world perfectly. Then one day they discover the world is more complicated. Claire is planning her future, I said calmly. And you're part of that future. Daniel sounded frustrated. And you're not. I didn't say that. Another pause filled the line. Then Daniel said something unexpected. Claire wants to meet with the attorney. Mr. Green, be a way to revise the trust. Revise. I almost smiled. Robert had anticipated that too. The trust can't be revised without my approval, I said. I know. And I'm not planning to change it. Daniel sighed. You're really going to let this destroy the relationship between us? That sentence landed quietly, because it revealed something important. Daniel believed the trust was creating the conflict. But the trust had only revealed it. Daniel, I said gently. Yes. Your father didn't create that clause to punish anyone. Then why did he create it? I looked out the kitchen window again. The maple tree stood tall in the morning sunlight. Because he believed something simple. What? That the way a family treats each other matters more than the money they inherit. Daniel didn't answer. And after a moment I added something else. There is still a path forward. What kind of path? One where respect comes before property. The line remained quiet. Finally Daniel spoke again. I'll talk to Claire. That sounds like a good place to start. We ended the call shortly after that. I set the phone down beside my coffee mug and sat there for a long time. Because I knew something Daniel didn't. Robert's trust wasn't just protecting the house. It was also revealing the truth about everyone connected to it. And the next decision Claire made would determine whether Daniel inherited anything at all. 3 days passed after my conversation with Daniel. 3 quiet days. No phone calls. No messages from Claire. At first that silence might have looked like peace from the outside. But when you've lived long enough, you understand that silence inside a family rarely means peace. More often it means people are deciding their next move. On the 4th afternoon my phone rang again. The name on the screen was unfamiliar. But when I answered I immediately recognized the voice. Mrs. Collins, the man said politely. It was Mr. Green, Robert's attorney. Good afternoon, I replied. I wanted to inform you about something, he said. His tone was calm, but slightly more formal than usual. What is it? I asked. I received a call this morning from a woman identifying herself as Claire Bennett. I leaned back slightly in the kitchen chair. I see. She requested a meeting to discuss the structure of the trust. Of course she did. Claire had always believed that problems could be solved by gathering enough information. And what did you tell her? I asked. I explained that the trust cannot be modified without your written approval. That's correct. Yes, he said. However, she also asked another question. What question? She asked whether any documentation had been submitted regarding the behavioral clause. I was quiet for a moment. That clause. The line Robert wrote that tied inheritance to respect. What did you say? I asked. I told her the trust conditions are evaluated based on both documented behavior and witness accounts. The room felt very still. And then? I asked. Mr. Green cleared his throat softly. She requested that I review the events of the dinner earlier this week. The place card. The photograph on my phone. The words Claire insisted were just a joke. I see, I said again. And Mrs. Collins, there's something else you should know. What is it? Your daughter-in-law sounded very confident that the clause could not possibly apply to her. I almost smiled. Claire had always been confident. Confident people often mistake certainty for protection. Did she say why? I asked. Yes. Mr. Green paused before continuing. She stated that her intentions toward you had always been respectful. Respectful. The word echoed quietly in my mind. I looked down at the kitchen table. The same table where Daniel once carved his initials with a pocket knife when he was 12. Robert had laughed about it for years. Families carry their history in small details like that. Mr. Green, I said calmly. Yes. Did you explain that the clause evaluates patterns of behavior? I did. And how did she respond? Another small pause. She asked if the inheritance would be revoked immediately. The directness of that question told me everything I needed to know. Not if it could happen, but when. What did you tell her? I asked. I told her the trust gives you the authority to determine whether the conditions have been violated. I took a slow breath. So the decision is mine. Yes, Mrs. Collins. That had always been Robert's plan. Not punishment. Responsibility. Thank you for letting me know, I said. Of course. Before ending the call, Mr. Green added one more thing. There is a meeting scheduled tomorrow morning. A meeting? Yes. With whom? With Daniel and Claire. I nodded slowly even though he couldn't see me. I'll be there. The next morning the sky over Boston was clear and cold. The kind of crisp autumn morning Robert used to love. He always said the air felt sharper that time of year. When I arrived at Mr. Green's office, Daniel and Claire were already sitting in the conference room. Daniel looked tired. Claire looked composed. As always, she greeted me politely. Margaret. Claire. Mr. Green sat at the head of the table with several documents arranged neatly in front of him. Thank you all for coming, he said. The meeting began quietly. Claire spoke first. Mr. Green, we appreciate you taking the time to clarify the trust structure. Of course, he replied. Claire folded her hands on the table. My concern is that a misunderstanding may have developed regarding Robert's intentions. Mr. Green looked at her carefully. In what way? Well, she said, glancing briefly toward Daniel before continuing, Robert loved his son very much. That is certainly true. And I believe he would want Daniel to eventually inherit the assets he built. That is also reflected in the trust, Mr. Green said. Claire nodded slightly. Then the behavioral clause must have been intended to address extreme situations. Possibly. Claire leaned forward slightly. But a single dinner conversation cannot reasonably be considered extreme. Daniel looked hopeful when she said that. Mr. Green turned toward me. Mrs. Collins? The room grew very quiet, because everyone at the table understood something. This wasn't a legal decision anymore. It was a personal one. I looked at Daniel. My son. The little boy who once held my hand crossing the street to his first day of school. Then I looked at Claire. Calm. Controlled. Confident that logic would win the argument. Finally I spoke. Robert believed something very simple, I said. What was that? Claire asked. Interrupt. He simply folded his hands on the table and waited. Daniel looked at me as if he were trying to see something familiar again. Something he had lost sight of over the years. Claire sat perfectly still. Her posture remained straight, her expression calm, but the certainty that had been there earlier was gone now. For the first time since this entire situation began, she wasn't controlling the direction of the conversation, because the direction no longer belonged to her. Mr. Green finally spoke. "Mrs. Collins," he said gently, "as trustee, the decision is yours." I nodded slowly. For a moment, I didn't look at the documents. Instead, I looked at Daniel. My son. The boy who once insisted on sleeping with the hallway light on because he was afraid of the dark. The boy who cried when his first goldfish died. The boy Robert carried on his shoulders through the park on summer afternoons. Time changes people. Responsibilities change them. So do the voices they listen to. "Daniel," I said quietly. "Yes, Mom." His voice was softer now. I took a slow breath. "Your father loved you very much." For a moment. Then I slid the document toward Mr. Green. "I am activating the trust exactly as Robert designed it." Mr. Green nodded once. "And the inheritance clause?" "It remains in place." Claire finally spoke. "So nothing changes." Her tone sounded confident again. But she misunderstood something. I turned toward her. "Something does change." Claire frowned slightly. "What?" "The clause is now officially active." The room grew still again. Daniel looked confused. "What does that mean?" "It means," Mr. Green explained calmly, "that from this moment forward, any attempt to pressure Mrs. Collins regarding the trust's assets will permanently revoke the inheritance." Claire's expression hardened slightly. "That seems extreme." I shook my head gently. "No." Daniel looked between us. "So, I still inherit everything. If the conditions remain respected," Mr. Green said. Daniel nodded slowly. Claire remained silent. The meeting ended shortly after that. Daniel left the office quietly. Claire followed him, her expression unreadable. I stayed behind for a moment to sign the final paperwork. When I finished, Mr. Green closed the folder and offered a small smile. "Your husband trusted your judgment," he said. "I hope I made the right decision," I replied. "I believe you did." Outside the office, the afternoon sun reflected off the harbor again. The same water I had watched a week earlier. But something inside me felt lighter now. Not victorious. Just peaceful. Because Robert had been right. Money doesn't test a family. Respect does. Left behind was the quiet reminder that dignity inside a family should never be negotiable.